You probably never heard her name. That's the thing that gets me, even now. There's a whole story about that night, and the men in it have books written about them, documentaries. One of them shook hands with a senator, and the person who actually kept half of them breathing, nobody knows her. She wasn't supposed to be there. Officially, she wasn't. Her name was Daniela Reyes, and the first time most of those operators saw her, they thought she'd wandered into the wrong building. Let me back up. I'll tell it the way it happened, because if I jump straight to the part everyone wants to hear, the part where the ammo runs dry and the radio's screaming and she's the only one moving, it won't land right. You have to understand who she was before any of that. You have to understand how quiet she was, because the quiet is the whole point. It was a forward operating base. I won't give you the real name. We called it Ironwood, and that wasn't its name either, but it'll do. Dust-colored everything. The kind of place where the air tastes like a battery and your sweat dries before it finishes falling. Summer there wasn't a season, it was a punishment. You'd walk 40 feet to the chow tent and arrive looking like you'd swum. Danny worked supply. Ammunition handling mostly, logistics, the unglamorous stuff. She was the one who counted the crates, signed the manifests, made sure the right boxes went to the right people. When a patrol rolled out, she'd already loaded their loadout the night before. When they rolled back in, hollow-eyed and short on rounds, she was the one tallying what they'd burned through. She was small. I want to be honest about that because people picture some kind of action figure, and that's not who she was. Maybe 5'3", slight. The kind of person who has to roll the sleeves of a medium twice. But you ever notice how the people who move heavy things all day get a particular kind of strong? Not Jim Strong. Stubborn strong. She could put an ammo can on her shoulder and walk like it weighed nothing, and you'd watch her do it and forget she was half the size of the guy who couldn't. And she didn't talk. That was the first thing anyone said about her. Quiet one, she'd nod. She'd answer if you asked her something direct, but she didn't fill silence the way most people do. She let it sit. Some folks read that as cold. The smarter ones figured out pretty quick it was just that she didn't waste anything, not words, not steps, not motion. Everything she did had a reason behind it. There was a rumor she'd been something else before logistics. Some said she'd washed out of a harder course. Some said she'd transferred after an incident nobody would explain. I asked her once, way later, and all she said was, "People decide what you are. You don't always get a vote." Then she went back to counting crates. The SEAL team, they were temporary at Ironwood, staging out of there for something up north. There were maybe a dozen of them, and they kept to themselves, the way that kind always does. Different patches, different swagger, the unmistakable energy of men who have been told their whole adult lives that they're the tip of the spear. Most of them were decent. A couple were exactly what you'd imagine. There was one named Cutter. That wasn't his name either, but the nickname fit, so I'll keep it. Who looked at the supply tent the way you'd look at a vending machine. A thing that dispenses what you need and otherwise doesn't exist. The first time Cutter and Danny crossed paths, he wanted a resupply pushed up the timeline, and she told him the manifest didn't clear until 600. "You serious right now?" he said. She didn't look up from the clipboard. "Manifest clears at 600. You know who we are." "I know you're not on tonight's manifest." He stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Then he laughed, that short, ugly laugh guys do when they're not actually amused, and walked off muttering something I won't repeat. She kept counting. Didn't blink. I was standing close enough to see her jaw tighten just slightly, and that was the only sign it touched her at all. Here's what Cutter didn't know. By 600 she had his team's full loadout staged, labeled, double-checked, and sitting exactly where it needed to be, plus an extra 2 cans of 5.56 she'd flagged from her own reserve because she'd looked at where they were going on the map and didn't like the math. Nobody asked her to do that. Nobody thanked her for it either because nobody knew. That was Danny. She'd already decided you might need something and quietly made sure you had it. And you'd never find out unless the moment came where the difference between living and not living was those 2 extra cans. The moment came. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me give you the night. It started ordinary. That's what people always forget about the worst nights, how normal they look at the front end. There was a card game in the maintenance bay. Somebody had smuggled in a speaker and was playing music too quietly to actually enjoy. The temperature had finally dropped enough that you could breathe. Danny was in the supply tent doing inventory by the light of a single bulb, because she preferred working when it was quiet and the day crew was gone. The SEAL team had pushed out around 2,200 for what was supposed to be a quick one. In and out. A name on a list, a building, a road home before sunrise. I heard the briefing afterward described as low complexity, which is a phrase that should be retired from the language, because nothing about what people do at night with rifles is ever low complexity. The first sign anything was wrong was the radio. Not the words, the tone. You learn, if you spend enough time around it, that you can read a radio call before you understand a single word of it. The pitch, the pace, the little catch in a voice that's trying very hard to sound flat. The TOC, that's the operations center, the brain of the base, went from background murmur to dead silence in about 4 seconds, and then everybody in there was leaning toward the speaker at once. The team had hit something, not the name on the list, something bigger and waiting for them. The building they'd entered turned out to be the wrong building, or the right building with the wrong number of people in it, and now they were pinned. 1 man down already, maybe 2. The road they'd come in on was no longer a road they could leave on, because somebody had thought of that before they did. I remember the way the base woke up. Not loud, that's another myth. There's no shouting, not at first. It's worse than shouting. It's 100 people moving very fast and very quietly all at once like a held breath. Boots, engines turning over, the clatter of gear. Somebody calling for the QRF, the quick reaction force, the guys who go get the guys who can't get themselves out. And the QRF needed ammunition. A lot of it, more than they'd staged for a quick one. That's when somebody ran into Danny's tent. She already had the door open. I want to say that again because it matters. By the time the runner reached the supply tent, half out of breath, ready to explain the emergency, Danny had heard the engines and read the night and was already pulling cans. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need the briefing. She'd looked at the map that afternoon, same as she always did, and she knew which direction they'd gone and roughly how far. And the moment the base changed pitch, she did the arithmetic in her head and started building a load. The runner, a kid, 19 maybe, named Pratt, froze in the doorway. "We need 5.56 and 7.62, she said, not stopping. "Frag smoke 203 rounds. I know how many vehicles." 3, maybe. 3, she handed him a can. "Move." And then she did the thing nobody expected, the thing that everything else hangs on. She grabbed her own gear. See, Danny's job ended at the tent. Her job was to hand the ammunition to the people who carried it into the dark. She was supply, support, the wire that connects the spear to the hand that throws it. She was not, repeat, not supposed to be on a QRF rolling toward an active firefight in the middle of the night. There was no version of the manifest, no line in any regulation, that put Daniela Reyes in that third vehicle. She climbed in anyway. The team sergeant running the QRF, big guy, name of Holloway, the kind of leader who's so calm in a crisis it's almost eerie, turned around in the front seat and clocked her in the back. Wedged between 2 cases of ammunition she was still strapping down. "Who are you?" he said. "Ray's Supply." "Get out." "You've got the wrong load count on your manifest," she said. "Whoever staged your trucks shorted you." "I fixed it, but it's not labeled right, and if you go through your basic load and start grabbing in the dark, you're gonna grab the wrong cans. I know where everything is. I packed it. You don't have time to learn it." "I do." Holloway looked at her for 1 second. Maybe 2. Out there in the dark, his men were dying by the minute, and this small, quiet woman he'd never met was telling him she'd save him 30 seconds of fumbling when 30 seconds was the entire currency of the night. "Stay low," he said. "Touch a weapon only if I tell you. You're a handler, not a shooter. Understood. Understood. The truck lurched forward into the dark, and that was it. No fanfare. No music swelling. Just a small woman in the back of a vehicle, sitting on 100 pounds of ammunition, going somewhere she was never meant to go because she'd done the math and the math said they'd need her. I'll tell you what the ride out was like, because she told me once, years after, in about 4 sentences, the way she said everything. She said it was the quietest she'd ever been, and she was always quiet, so that's saying something. She said she watched the men's hands, not their faces, their hands. She said you can tell who's going to be okay by their hands, whether they're steady on the rifle or whether they keep adjusting, re-gripping, looking for something to do. She said most of these hands were steady, which she found comforting, and a couple weren't, which she found worse than the gunfire she could already hear rolling in over the engine noise. And she said the thing she remembered most was the smell of the ammunition. The faint oil and metal smell of the cans pressed against her back. She'd smelled it 10,000 times in a warehouse where nothing was at stake. Now it smelled completely different. Same smell, different meaning. She said that was the moment it became real, not the radio, not the engines, not Holloway telling her to stay low. The smell. The same cans, suddenly weighing 1,000 times more. Up ahead, past the ridgeline, the night was lit up wrong. Orange where it should have been black. The sound had stopped being something you heard and become something you felt in your sternum. Holloway keyed his radio. QRF inbound, 2 minutes, talk to me. The voice that came back was Cutter's. The same Cutter who'd looked at her like a vending machine. Except now his voice had that catch in it, the one you can't fake away. We're black on ammo, he said. I say again, we are black on ammo. Whatever you're bringing, bring it fast. Black on ammo. Out. Empty. The single worst thing a man in a gunfight can say into a radio. And in the back of the third truck, a quiet woman nobody knew the name of put her hand flat on a can of 5.56. One of the 2 extra cans she'd flagged that morning because she didn't like the math, and got ready to move the truck, didn't stop so much as it stopped being driven. Holloway's driver, a kid named Owens, threw it sideways behind a low mud wall, and for a second the whole world was dust, and the smell of burned brakes and everyone's bodies slamming forward against their straps. Then the doors were open, and the men were gone. That's the part nobody tells you right. When the QRF dismounts, it's not a movie. There's no slow jog with the camera circling. It's violence in the truest sense, bodies hurled out into the dark, fast and ugly and practiced, gone from the vehicle before your brain registers they moved. 1 second the truck was full. The next, Danny was alone in the back with the cans and the ringing in her ears, and the night had become a wall of noise. She'd never heard anything like it. She told me that too. She said the firefights in the movies are polite. They take turns. Real ones don't. Real ones are a single continuous tearing sound, like the sky is being ripped down the middle and won't stop, and underneath it the deeper thump of things you feel before you hear, and you can't tell what's incoming and what's outgoing, and after a while you stop trying. She sat very still for exactly 1 breath. Then she heard Holloway's voice, not on the radio, close, right outside the truck, bellowing over the noise. Ammo up. I need ammo up. And Danny moved. Here's where it stops being a story about a quiet woman in a truck, and starts being the story everyone eventually heard, even if they never learned her name. The team was pinned in a building maybe 100 meters off. 100 meters doesn't sound like much. Stand at one end of a soccer field and look at the other end. That's 100 meters. Now imagine crossing it with no cover, in the dark, carrying a 40-pound can of ammunition in each hand, with rounds coming the other way fast enough to turn the dirt around your feet into little fountains. That's the run she had to make, twice, then more times after that. The men who could shoot were shooting. The men who were hit were being worked on. There was nobody to spare to be a mule, and the ammunition was in the truck, and the truck was 100 meters from the men who'd die without it. Somebody had to be the wire connecting the two. Somebody had to carry. Holloway was going to do it himself. He'd already grabbed a can and was bracing to run, which would have been the end of him, because a team sergeant sprinting across open ground is a team sergeant who isn't coordinating the fight, and a fight without coordination is just a lot of brave men dying separately. Danny put her hand on the can he was holding. "You run it, you stop running the fight," she said. 11 words flat, no drama. "I'll carry, tell me where." Holloway looked at her. I keep coming back to that look, the second one, the one out there in the dark with everything coming apart around them. The first time he'd looked at her in the truck, he'd seen supply. A clipboard, a problem. This time he saw something else. He told me years later, and Holloway is not a man who hands out compliments, he said. She had the calmest eyes I'd seen all night, and I'd been looking at my own guy's eyes for 10 minutes. She wasn't scared. Or if she was, she'd put it somewhere I couldn't see. I've trained men for years to do what she did standing in the back of that truck deciding by herself. He pointed. "That doorway, the one with the muzzle flashes coming out of it, those are ours. Go in low, hand off, come back the same line. Do not stop in the middle. The middle is where you die. Go." She went. I've thought a lot about that first run. 100 meters, 2 cans. No weapon, she wasn't a shooter, Holloway had told her, and she never picked one up that whole night, which is its own kind of remarkable when you think about it. She ran across the most dangerous strip of ground in that entire province, carrying the very thing everyone there was trying to kill each other over. And she did it with her hands full and no way to fight back. And she did it because the math said somebody had to. She told me she didn't run in a straight line, even though that's shortest, because straight lines are what people aim at. She ran the way water runs downhill, finding the dips, the low spots, the half-second of shadow behind a broken cart, the lee of a dead truck. She'd memorized the ground in the 3 seconds of headlight she'd got when they pulled in. She knew where the cover was before she needed it. That wasn't luck. That was the same brain that flagged 2 extra cans of 5.56 because she didn't like the math. She was always counting. A round went through the can in her left hand. She felt it, a punch, a jolt up her arm, the metal screaming, and she didn't stop, because the middle is where you die, and she was in the middle. She got to the doorway and half fell, half dove through it, and slid the cans across the floor toward the nearest man. The nearest man was Cutter. He was down to nothing. He told the radio he was black on ammo, and he'd meant it. He had 1 round left, he said later, one, and he was saving it for a reason men in that situation save their last round for, a reason I won't say out loud. And then 120 pounds of ammunition came sliding across a dirt floor and stopped against his knee, and behind it, breathing hard, dust-covered, eyes calm, was the supply clerk he'd called a vending machine 8 hours earlier. He told me he didn't recognize her at first. Then he did, and he said for 1 full second in the middle of the worst night of his life, he forgot to keep fighting because his brain just refused to put those 2 things together. Her, here, with this. "You," he started. "It's the load I flagged this morning," she said, already cracking the can open for him, hands moving fast, feeding him magazines like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 2 extra cans of 5.56. I didn't like your route. Reload. I'll get the next one." And she was up and gone. Back out the doorway, back into the middle, back to the truck, because there were more men and more empty rifles and only one of her. Cutter watched her go. Then he loaded his weapon and got back in the fight, and he told me, this big hard man, years later, voice doing something complicated, he said. "I spent 8 years being the guy who runs toward it. And I sat there with a full magazine because a girl I'd been rude to ran 100 meters under fire to bring it to me and went back for more, and never once asked me to thank her or notice her or even know her name. I've thought about that every day since. Every single day." She made the run 4 times. 4, out, hand off, back, reload the carry, out again. Each time the ground was a little more torn up. Each time there were a few less men shooting, and a few more being worked on by the medic. Each time the line she ran got a little more dangerous, because the people on the other side had started to notice that something small and fast kept crossing the open ground, and the men in the building kept being able to shoot back, and they didn't like the connection. On the third run she got hit. Not bad, not at first. A graze along the back of the shoulder, a hot line that she said felt like someone had pressed an iron to her skin. She didn't even know she'd been shot until she was back at the truck and reached up and her hand came away dark. She told me she looked at her hand for a second, the way you look at something that doesn't quite make sense, and then she picked up 2 more cans because the math hadn't changed. Men were still empty. The cans were still in the truck. She was still the wire. Holloway saw the blood on the 4th run and grabbed her arm as she came back. "You're hit. It's a graze. You're hit, Rays." "It's a graze," she said again, "and they're still black on the south side. Let go of my arm." He told me he let go of her arm. What was I gonna do, he said. Order her to stop. She wasn't even mine to order. She was supply. She didn't have to be there at all. I let go of her arm and I let her go, and I have made peace with most things from that night, but I have not entirely made peace with that one. She ran the south side. They weren't black anymore after that. Around then the radio changed pitch again, but the good way this time. Air was inbound. The thing every pin-down team prays for. The sound that turns the whole math of a night upside down. Somewhere up in the dark, there was now a presence that the people on the other side did not want to be standing under, and they knew it, and the volume of fire coming at the building began, slowly, grudgingly, to fall. But falling is not stopped, and in the gap between air is coming and air is here, there's a stretch of time where the people on the other side throw everything they have left, because they know their window is closing. Veterans will tell you that gap is the most dangerous part of the whole night, the wounded animal moment. That's the moment it all comes down to. That's part 3. Because that's when the worst of it happened, when the can she was carrying wasn't for a rifle at all, and the man she ran it to wasn't going to make it without her, and a quiet woman who'd been told you're a handler, not a shooter, had to decide what kind of person she actually was when the rules ran out. You ever watch a fire right before someone throws water on it? How it doesn't die down, it flares. Gets taller, hotter, meaner, like it knows what's coming and wants to do as much damage as it can in the time it's got left. That's what the other side did when they heard the aircraft. The fire didn't fall off the way Danny hoped. For about 90 seconds it got worse. Everything they had left, all at once, aimed at the building, because they knew their window was shutting and they wanted to take as many men with them as they could before it did. Holloway called it the worst 90 seconds of the night, and Holloway had been counting his nights for a long time. And in the middle of those 90 seconds, the call came that changed what Danny was doing entirely. It wasn't ammo up. It was the medic. His voice this time, and it was different from all the other voices, tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear for himself. "I need a hand on the casualty. Now, I can't hold pressure and move him myself. Somebody, anybody, get to the back room." Here's the thing about that call. Everybody who could move was a shooter, and every shooter who stopped shooting in those 90 seconds was making a hole in the wall of fire, keeping them all alive. The medic knew it. That's why his voice cracked. He was asking for a hand he knew nobody could spare, because the man on the floor in front of him was going to die in the next 2 minutes without one, and there was no one who could leave the line. No one except a small woman who wasn't on the line, who wasn't supposed to be there at all, who'd been told very clearly hours earlier, "You're a handler, not a shooter." She'd just come back to the truck. There was a can in each hand. Cutter's side was loaded now, Holloway's side was holding, the south side was quiet. The thing she'd been doing all night, carrying ammunition to empty rifles, was, for this one moment, done. There were no empty rifles for her to feed. So she dropped the cans. She told me that's the part she remembers clearest. Not the running, not the graze, not the noise. Dropping the cans. Because every instinct in her, the instinct that had been drilled into her bones across years of being supply, screamed that her job was the can. The can was hers. The can was the one thing she knew she was allowed to touch. And she set them down in the dirt and left them and ran toward the building empty-handed, toward a back room, toward a job that was nobody's job and had just become hers because she was the only one not already spending herself somewhere else. The back room was bad. I'm not going to describe it in a way that's hard to hear, but I'll tell you it was bad, and that the man on the floor was young, and that the medic, a guy they called Doc, like all medics get called, was kneeling in something dark with both hands pressed down hard on the young man's leg, high near the hip in the one place a tourniquet can't reach. That's the worst place. Everybody who's done this knows that's the worst place. You can't tie it off. You can only press and pray and hold. And Doc couldn't move him while he pressed. And the building was taking fire, and the back room had a window, and the window was a problem, and the young man had to come off the floor and away from that window, or none of it would matter anyway. I need you to press exactly where my hands are, Doc said, fast, not looking up. When I lift, you go down, as hard as you can. You will not hurt him. You cannot press too hard. Do you understand me? She put her hands where his hands were. Small hands. He lifted, she went down, and she pressed with everything she had, all that stubborn warehouse strength, all of it, into one spot the size of a fist, and Doc grabbed the young man under the arms, and together they dragged him off the floor and away from the window, her shuffling on her knees the whole way, never lifting the pressure, not once, because lifting the pressure meant losing him. She held that pressure for 11 minutes. 11 minutes, I want you to sit with that number. Try it, right now, wherever you are. Press your 2 thumbs into your own thigh as hard as you possibly can and hold it. Don't ease off. Count the seconds. Most people can't make it past 40 before their hands start to shake and ache and beg. Now imagine doing it for 11 minutes, with everything you have, kneeling in the dark, with a man's life in the gap between your hands and the floor, while the building you're in is being shot at, and you can't see the door, and you don't know if the air ever actually came or if you imagined it. She didn't talk the whole time. Of course she didn't. That was Danny. Doc told me later he kept talking to her. Good, that's good, keep it there, don't ease off, and she'd just nod, this small steady nod, eyes down on her own hands, face like stone. He said the one thing she said the entire time was when the young man started to fade and his eyes rolled back, and Doc reached over to do something, and Danny said very quietly without looking up, "Talk to him. I've got the leg. You talk to him." So Doc talked to the kid, told him about home, about a dog the kid had mentioned once, about anything, while a supply clerk with a graze in her shoulder held the only thing keeping his blood inside his body. And the kid stayed. Faded, came back, but he stayed. Outside, the air arrived. I won't dwell on it, because it's not really her part of the story, but the sound of the world flipped over. The wall of fire that had been pinning the team for nearly an hour broke apart in under a minute. Once there was something overhead the other side feared more than the men in the building. The shooting fell off. Then it stopped. Then there was that ringing, enormous silence that comes after, the one that's almost as loud as the noise was. And in the back room, Danny kept pressing, because nobody had told her to stop, and because the silence outside didn't change the fact that the kid would still bleed out if she let go, and because she had decided, the way she decided everything, with cold, clean arithmetic. The fight is over and this is not, so I keep going. It was Cutter who found them. He came through the building room by room, the way you do, clearing as he went, and he pushed into the back room expecting. I don't know what he expected. And he found Doc cradling a kid's head and talking to him about a dog, and he found the supply clerk on her knees in the dark, both hands jammed down into the worst wound he'd seen all night, soaked to the elbows, shaking with the effort, jaw set, not making a sound. He told me he just stood there. The big hard man, he said, I'd called her a vending machine, that morning, to her face basically. And there she was 8 hours later holding one of my brothers together with her bare hands, and she still hadn't said one word about herself the whole night. Not one. She didn't even look up at me. She just said. He had to stop for a second when he told me this part. She said, "Get the litter, he's coming with us. He's not staying here." They got the litter. They got the kid out. Danny held pressure through the load, through the run back to the trucks, and she ran that 100 meters one more time, the fifth time, except this time she wasn't carrying a can. She was kneeling on a moving litter with her hands buried in a wound. 4 men carrying the whole thing at a dead sprint while she held on and held down and refused, the entire way, to ease off even an ounce. She held it in the truck. She held it the whole ride back. She held it while Owens drove like the devil and the base lights came up out of the dark and the medical tent threw its doors open and people in scrubs came running. She held it until a trauma surgeon physically put his hands over hers and said, clearly, twice, "I've got it. You can let go. I've got it now." And she told me this is the only time in the whole telling her voice did anything, she said. That was the hardest part, not the running, not getting hit, letting go. Because for 11 minutes that kid was alive because of exactly where my hands were, and if I moved them wrong, even for the half second of the handoff, he might not be. So I waited until I felt the doctor's hands take the exact spot, and then I let go, and then my own hands wouldn't open. They'd been clenched so long they'd locked up. Somebody had to help me open them. The kid lived. I'll tell you his name in part 4, because his name matters to how this ends, and because of what he did years later, when he found out who she was. And I'll tell you what happened in the hours after, the silence, the way nobody knew what to do with her, the moment she just quietly went back to the supply tent and started counting cans again like none of it had happened. Because that part, the after, is somehow the part that tells you the most about who she really was. Here's what they don't show you in the movies. After the worst night of your life, the sun still comes up. Same as always. It doesn't care. It crawls over the wire and turns everything that battery acid gold color, and the day starts whether you're ready for it or not. The kid's name was Marcus Bell. Everybody called him Bell. 22 years old. The dog Doc kept talking about to keep him awake was named Rufus, an old yellow lab back in a town in Georgia I'll keep to myself. Bell came off that truck more dead than alive, and by the time the sun came up he was stable enough to fly out to a real hospital. And the surgeon, the one who'd had to pry Danny's locked hands open, said the only reason Bell still had a leg, and more than that, the only reason Bell was alive at all, was that someone had held pressure on exactly the right spot, perfectly, without easing off, for the entire window when easing off would have killed him. Whoever did that, the surgeon said, knew what they were doing. That wasn't luck. That was somebody who didn't panic and didn't quit. Who was it? And here's the thing. Nobody could quite answer him, because the someone had already disappeared. While Bell was being loaded onto the bird, while Holloway was doing the brutal accounting that follows a night like that, while Cutter was sitting on an ammo can with his head in his hands trying to make the morning make sense, Danny had walked back to the supply tent. Alone, in the dark before the sun was even up, blood on her sleeves, a graze in her shoulder she still hadn't looked at, hands that wouldn't fully close. And she'd started counting cans. I'm not making that up for effect. That's exactly what she did. There was a manifest to reconcile. A lot of ammunition had gone out the door in a hurry and not all of it had come back, and somewhere in her, the part that was supply, the part that had been supply long before that night and would be supply long after, knew that the count had to be right or the next patrol might roll out short. So she got a fresh clipboard and she lit the single bulb and she started counting, because that was her job and the night was over and the job wasn't. That's where Holloway found her. He'd gone looking. He told me he didn't even know what he was looking for. He just knew there was a person who'd done something he couldn't fully process, and he needed to find her before the machine of the day swallowed everybody up. And he pushed open the supply tent flap, and there she was, under the one bulb, counting crates, her sleeves stiff and dark, like the last 6 hours had been somebody else's life. "Raise," he said. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" "Reconciling the manifest. She didn't stop counting. You burned through more than the trucks were carrying. I'm finding out where the gap is so the morning patrol doesn't go out short. He stood there. He told me he genuinely did not know what to say to her. This man who'd led other men through hell and back, who always had the calm word, the right command. He stood in that tent and could not find a single thing to say to a small woman counting bullets with blood on her sleeves. Finally he said, "You need to get that shoulder looked at. After the count." "Raise." "After the count, Sergeant, it's a graze, the count's not." And he let her finish the count. He told me he stood there the whole time and let her finish, because he understood, somewhere in him, that the counting was how she was holding herself together, that the arithmetic was the same thing it had always been for her, a way to make a chaotic world hold still and make sense, and that taking it from her right then would have done more harm than the graze. When she was done, she set the clipboard down, and only then did she let him walk her to the medical tent. And the whole way there, he said, she didn't say a word about Bell or the run or the 11 minutes. She talked about the manifest. There was a discrepancy of 2 cans, she told him. 2 cans of 5.56 unaccounted for. It took Holloway a second, then he realized. Those were the 2 cans she'd flagged that morning. The extra ones. The ones she'd added because she didn't like Cutter's route. They were missing from the official count because they'd never officially existed. She'd put them in off the books, on instinct, on her own judgment. And they were the cans that had kept Cutter alive when he was down to 1 round and a bad plan. "There's no discrepancy, Rays," Holloway said. "Those 2 cans aren't missing. Those 2 cans are the whole reason any of us are standing here." She thought about that. Then she said the most Danny thing she ever said. She said, "Then the count's still wrong, I just know why now." And she went and got her shoulder stitched. Word got around the way it does. Not because she told anyone. She never told anyone. It got around because Doc told it, and Cutter told it, and the surgeon asked questions, and a dozen men who'd been on that line started comparing notes and realized that the small, fast shape they'd half seen crossing the open ground all night, the one they'd assumed was one of their own, had been the supply clerk, the one with the clipboard, the one nobody had bothered to learn the name of. The way men like that handle shame is they overcorrect, and within a day Danny went from invisible to the most talked-about person on the base, which she hated. She hated it openly. In the only way she ever showed emotion, by getting quieter and working harder and avoiding the chow tent. People wanted to shake her hand. People wanted to tell the story back to her, as if she hadn't been there. One guy tried to give her his unit coin, this big sentimental gesture, and she looked at it and said, "I didn't do it for a coin," and went back to work. And the poor guy didn't know whether he'd been insulted or shown something true about himself. Cutter was the one who finally got through to her, and it's because he didn't try to thank her. He came to the supply tent on her last night before the team rotated out. He didn't bring a coin. He didn't make a speech. He just stood in the doorway, the same doorway he'd filled that first morning demanding an early resupply, and he said, "I called you a vending machine." She kept counting, "I remember." "I was wrong, not just about that. About the whole, about what the job is. I've spent my whole career thinking the only thing that matters is the guy who pulls the trigger. And I'd have died with 1 round in my rifle if a supply clerk hadn't done math I was too arrogant to do myself." He paused. "I'm not gonna thank you, because Doc says you hate it, and I figure you've earned the right to not be thanked the way you want. So I'm just gonna tell you were wrong about one thing." She looked up at that. "What?" "You said people decide what you are and you don't get a vote." He'd heard about that somehow. Word gets around. You voted. That night. You voted as loud as a person can. You just did it with your hands instead of your mouth. And Daniela Reyes, who didn't waste words, who let silences sit, who'd been called cold by people too dumb to look closer, she didn't say anything to that. She just nodded. The small, steady nod. The same one Doc had watched her give for 11 minutes in the dark. Then she went back to counting cans. The team rotated out. The war did what wars do and kept going. Belle flew home to Georgia and to Rufus the yellow lab and to a long, hard recovery. And Danny finished her time at Ironwood counting crates and signing manifests and quietly flagging extra cans on routes she didn't like. And as far as the official record was concerned, nothing unusual had ever happened in that supply tent at all. There was no medal, not then. You'll want there to have been one, right at that moment, and there wasn't, because the paperwork for that kind of thing is slow and complicated when the person involved wasn't supposed to be where she was, doing what she did, off any manifest or order or plan. The system doesn't know what to do with a supply clerk who saved a SEAL team. There's no box on the form for that. So it sat for years. But it didn't disappear, because Belle remembered, and Cutter remembered. And Holloway, who had not entirely made peace with letting go of her arm, remembered hardest of all. And years later, when Belle could walk again, when the men had scattered to civilian lives and reunions and the long quiet that follows service, they came back for her. All of them. To finish a count that had never been right. That's part 5. The reunion. The thing they did when they found her. And what she said when a room full of the hardest men you can imagine stood up all at once for the quiet woman who'd carried ammo and stayed silent until the night they needed her. 7 years. That's how long it took. 7 years between the night at Ironwood and the day they finally found her. And I want to tell you why it took so long, because the why is part of the whole point. It took so long because Danny didn't want to be found. She'd left the service a few years after that deployment. Quietly, how else? No big ceremony, no speeches. She'd gone home to a small town in the high desert, the kind of place with one stoplight and a diner and a lot of sky, and she'd taken a job at a feed store of all things, counting things, loading things, signing for things. The same shape of work, in a smaller and softer world, because it turned out that the thing she was good at, making a chaotic inventory hold still and make sense, was a thing you could do far away from anyone with a rifle. She didn't go to reunions. She didn't join the groups. She wasn't on any of the rosters the men used to find each other. She'd done a hard thing once, the hardest thing, and then she'd folded it up and put it somewhere quiet and gone back to her life, and that, she figured, was that. But Belle never stopped looking. Marcus Bell spent those 7 years learning to walk right again, and then learning to run again, which the doctors had told him he never would, and he did it anyway because that's the kind of stubborn that night had put in him. And the whole time in the back of everything was a question he could not let go of. Who held my leg? He knew the broad strokes. A supply clerk. A woman. He knew the name Reyes, but the system had scrubbed her out of the official account. She wasn't supposed to be there, remember, so the after-action report had a gap shaped exactly like her. And Reyes is not a rare name, and people who leave the service and go to ground in one-stoplight towns are not easy to find. He found her the way these things actually happen, not through any database. Through Holloway, who'd kept a single scrap of paper for 7 years, a supply manifest from Ironwood, the real one with her full name and signature on it, that he'd quietly pocketed before the records got cleaned up, because some part of him had known even then that this was a piece of paper that should not be allowed to disappear. Daniela Reyes. Her signature, small and precise, at the bottom of a count. It took Bell 4 months of phone calls after that, but he found the feed store, and he found out she worked Tuesdays and Saturdays, and he made some calls, the rest of them, and they all agreed, without much discussion, that this was not a thing you did over the phone. She was loading 50-pound feed sacks into the back of a rancher's truck on a Saturday morning when they came. She told me she heard the vehicles first, that old instinct, reading engines, and she didn't think much of it, because trucks come and go at a feed store all day. Then she straightened up with a sack on her shoulder and there were men getting out, and she didn't recognize them at first because 7 years in civilian clothes change a person, and then she did. Holloway, Doc, Cutter, Owens, who'd driven like the devil, 5, 6 others off that line, And out of the last truck, slower than the rest, with a hitch in his step that he'd fought 7 years to make as small as it was, Belle. She set the feed sack down. She told me her hands did the thing again. Wouldn't quite open. 7 years later, in the bright desert morning, at the sight of these men, her hands locked up the exact way they had on the litter. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Belle walked up to her, walked, on his own 2 legs, on the legs she'd held together, and he stopped in front of her, and he didn't say thank you either, because by then they all knew she didn't want it, and instead he just rolled up his pant leg and showed her the scar. The long, terrible scar, high on the thigh, in the one place a tourniquet can't reach. "I named my daughter after you," he said. "Daniela, we call her Danny, she's 3. She's got a dog named Rufus, the second one, because the first one passed, but I couldn't have a kid grow up without a Rufus." His voice did something. "I've been trying to find you for 7 years to tell you that, and to bring you something. Here's what they brought." You remember the count that was never right. 2 cans of 5.56, unaccounted for, off the books, the extra ones she'd flagged because she didn't like Cutter's root, the ones that kept him alive. Holloway had never forgotten it. "The count's still wrong," she'd said. "I just know why now." For 7 years between them, they'd done something about it. They'd fought the slow, stupid paperwork. They'd written statements, all of them, Holloway, Cutter, Doc, the surgeon, every man on that line who'd seen the small, fast shape cross the open ground. They'd pushed it up through channels that didn't want it, past officers who said it was too old and too irregular and too hard to document. And they had not stopped, because if there was one thing that night had taught a dozen hard men, it was that you do not ease off the pressure just because it's difficult and your hands are shaking. Holloway stepped forward and held out a small flat box. It had taken 7 years, but the system had finally found a box on the form for what a supply clerk did at Ironwood. Inside was a medal. The specific one doesn't matter for this telling, but it was real, and it was high, and it was hers, and her name was on the citation in full. Daniela Reyes. No longer scrubbed out. No longer a gap shaped exactly like her. Written down at last, in a count that was finally right. She looked at it in the box. She didn't pick it up right away. And Cutter, older now, softer than he'd been, the arrogance long since burned out of him, said the thing that broke her open, the only time anyone ever saw it happen. He said, "You told me once that people decide what you are and you don't get a vote. We're the people, and we voted. It took us 7 years to file the paperwork, but we voted. You're not the vending machine. You never were. You're the reason every single one of us got to go home and have lives and kids and bad knees and boring jobs." He nodded at the box. "The count's right now. We fixed it. That's all this is. We just came to make the count right." She cried, once. The only time any of them ever saw it. She told me about it without any shame, years after, in that same flat, steady voice that did, just for this part, go a little rough. She said it wasn't the medal. The medal she could have lived without. She'd lived without it 7 years and meant to live without it forever. She said it was the word count. That Cutter had understood somehow, the only language she'd ever fully trusted. That a thing could be unbalanced and wrong for years, sitting in the dark unreconciled, and that someone, a whole roomful of someones, could care enough to do the slow, patient, hard work of making it add up. That she had spent her whole life being the person who made the numbers come out right for everyone else. And for once, for the first time she could remember, a group of people had decided that she was the number that didn't add up, and they'd refused to rest until she did. She picked up the medal. She held it the way she held everything, carefully, like it had a correct place it belonged. Then, because she was Danny, and because some things don't change and shouldn't, she put it in her pocket, and she looked at the rancher's truck still half-loaded behind her, and she said, "I've got 6 more sacks to load. You can stay for coffee after if you want. There's a diner." And the men, the hardest men you could imagine, men with documentaries and handshakes from senators, men who'd carried each other out of places that should have killed them all. They took off their nice clothes jackets, and they loaded the last 6 feed sacks with her, in the bright desert morning, and then they all went and had coffee at a diner with one stoplight outside. I think about her a lot. Not because of the run, though the run was something. 100 meters, 5 times, no weapon, hands full, the most dangerous strip of ground in the province, because the math said somebody had to, and she was the only one who'd done the math. And not because of the 11 minutes, though I dare you to press your thumbs into your own leg and last even one. I think about her because of the part where the sun came up and she went back and counted the cans. Because she never told a soul. Because she'd have lived her whole life letting everyone believe she was just the quiet supply clerk, the vending machine, the wire nobody notices until the current stops. Because the world is full of people who do the loud, brave thing and make sure everyone knows, and it is held up quietly by people who do the loud, brave thing and then go reconcile a manifest and never mention it again. Most of them never get found. Most of their counts stay wrong forever. Hers got found. Hers got made right. And the only reason it did is that a man learned to walk again on a leg she held together and named his daughter after her and refused to ease off the pressure for 7 years. So here's the line I'll leave you with. It's something Holloway said to me at the end when I asked him what he'd want people to take from the whole thing. He thought about it a long time, and then he said, "The loudest people get the stories told about them, but it's the quiet ones who decide whether there's anyone left alive to tell them." She carried ammo. She stayed quiet until they needed her, and then, just once with her hands instead of her mouth, she said everything.